Yasodanandana Prajajanaranjana Yamunatira Panachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gornitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we're reading from Canto 10, Chapter 73, Text 19 and 20. So we'll chant Text 19 together. Distya vyavasitam bhupa bhavantarita bhashinaha Shri Aishwarya Madonaham Pasya Unmadakam Nirnam Distya Vyavasitam Bhupa Bhavantarita Bhashinaha Sri Aishwarya Madonaham Pasya Unmadakam Nirnam Distya Vyavasitam Bhupa Bhavantarita Bhashinaha Sri Aishwarya Madonaham Pasya unmadakam nirnam. Please chant. Distya vyavasitam bhupa bhavantarita pasina Shri Aishwarya Madonaham Pasya unmadakam nirnam Distya vyavasitam bhupa bhavantarita pasina Shri Aishwarya Madonaham Pasya unmadakam nirnam. And the word for word, distya, fortunate. Vyavasitam, your resolve. Bhupa, O kings. Bhavanta, you. Rita, truthfully. Vasinaha, speaking. Shri, of opulence. Aishwarya, and power. Mada, due to the intoxication. Unaham, lack of restraint. Pashye, I see. Unmadakam, maddening. Nirnam, for human beings. And the translation by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. Fortunately, you have come to the proper conclusion, my dear kings. And what you have spoken is true. I can see that human beings' lack of self-restraint, which arises from their intoxication with opulence and power, simply leads to madness. And then text 30. Hai hayo nahu saveno ravano narako pare Srimadat pam sitaha shanat devadaitya nareshvaraham. And the translation for text 30. Haya, Nahusa, Vena, Ravana, Naraka, and many others, rulers of demigods, men and demons, fell from their elevated positions because of infatuation with material opulence. And the purport by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. As described by Sridhar Swami, because Haya stole the desire car of Lord Parshuram's father, Janmadagni, Parshuram killed him and his impudent sons. Nahusa became puffed up when he temporarily assumed the post of Indra. When out of pride, Nahusa ordered some brahmanas to carry him in a palanquin to an illicit meeting with Lord Indra's chaste wife, Sachi, the brahmanas made him fall down from his position and become an old man. King Vena was similarly mad, and when he insulted the brahmanas, they killed him by loud incantations of the syllable hum. Ravana was a famous ruler of the Rakshasas, but out of lust, he kidnapped Mother Sita, and thus her husband, Lord Ramachandra, killed him. Naraka was a ruler of the Daityas who dared to steal Mother Aditi's earrings, and for his offense, he was also killed. Thus, throughout history, powerful leaders have fallen from their position because they became intoxicated with their so-called opulence. Om Jnanatimandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshurinmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swam Rupakadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavams Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Radha Krishna Padansa Gana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitam Cha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagat Pate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate. Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radha Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Panchakalpatarubhya Shakripa Sindhubhya Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Ram Padaswami Iti Namine. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nivishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'll just reread the translation. Fortunately, this is Krishna talking to the kings. Fortunately, you have come to the proper conclusion, my dear kings, and what you have spoken is true. I can see that human beings' lack of self-restraint, which arises from the intoxication with opulence and power, simply leads to madness. And the next verse. Haya, Nahusa, Vena, Ravana, Naraka, and many other rulers of demigods, men and demons fell from their elevated positions because of infatuation with material opulence. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary on text 19 has him giving Lord Krishna's words to the king as follows. So this is Srila Vishwanath's putting across Krishna's words. Quote, you are very fortunate to have the resolve that devotional service alone should be performed. Most worldly kings are mad after sense enjoyment and bound by Maya. From wealth, Shri, comes the concept of power, Aishvarya. From Aishvarya comes intoxication, Mada, and from intoxication comes bondage, Unaham. So, close quote. So that was Srila Vishwanath breaking down Krishna's statement and having Krishna speak those words and communicate in that way to the kings. So, Lord Krishna is agreeing with what the kings have stated. And their statement had been the following. This was the statement of the kings. Please tell us how we may constantly remember your lotus feet, though we continue in the cycle of birth and death in this world. That was text 15. So by their wanting to constantly remember the lotus feet of Lord Krishna, this indicates their resolve to perform devotional service. So hence you can see Srila Vishwanath using or having Krishna communicate where he's actually expanded. Krishna's statement is, you are very fortunate to have the resolve that devotional service alone should be performed. And so how that understanding has come is that the fact that the king stated they wanted to constantly remember the lotus feet of Lord Krishna. So this indicates that resolve to perform devotional service. Thus, Lord Krishna is agreeing with what they have stated. It is, in fact, a dependence on Lord Krishna which they are espousing. And Krishna himself advises the utter necessity of acting in devotion. And we get this in his statements in Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, who was also a king. And this was how Krishna advises this necessity of acting in devotion. In all activities, just depend upon me and work always under my protection. In such devotional service, be fully conscious of me. So that was Bhagavad Gita 1857. So this working in pure devotional service or working in Krishna consciousness means that one does not, and this is quoting, I'm using Srila Prabhupada's words, where he's actually commenting in Bhagavad Gita 1857. So this is how not, if in order to work in pure devotional service or working in Krishna consciousness, then this is what one does not do. And this is, of course, applicable to the kings. And these are Srila Prabhupada's words. One does not act as the master of the world. Just like a servant, one should act fully under the direction of the Supreme Lord. So this means that one's got no goal in life save and except acting in Krishna consciousness, just to satisfy Lord Krishna. So you notice how it's a kind of graphic illustration of a certain consciousness. You're dealing with persons that were rulers of kingdoms, and they themselves have reached this conclusion that they want to constantly remember the lotus feet of Lord Krishna, and Lord Krishna expands upon it where he's saying, act under my protection. So not to them, but I'm drawing from his teachings in Bhagavad Gita. And so this means that actually the switch that has to happen for the king is that they're not acting as masters of the world, but rather they're acting like servants who are fully under the direction of the Supreme Lord. So it's a switch in consciousness. And Lord Krishna's statement, because this is what he tells the king, in such devotional service, be fully conscious of me, or rather he tells Arjuna, be fully conscious of me, means that while one is acting, so this is, applicable to everyone, while one is acting fully under the direction of the Lord, meaning his messages in Bhagavad Gita, his teachings, or under the guidance of his representative, one should think of Krishna only. That's how Srila Prabhupada puts it. And Srila Prabhupada says that this should be the uppermost thought in one's mind. I have been appointed to discharge this particular duty by Krishna. So, Srila Jiva Goswami, he notes that Lord Krishna is praising the kings to strengthen their bhakti or their devotional service by agreeing with their statement. And Krishna contrasts the resolution that's been reached by the kings to the position of worldly kings. So notice he contrasts that there's a good understanding of what's happening. So here's the contrast that he's making with the position of worldly kings. They are mad after sense enjoyment and bound by Maya. So this was, in fact, how the kings described their condition. And this is how the kings, exactly how Krishna is contrasting the position of those acting in a mood of devotional service to him, and then contrasting it with kings who are deluded by illusion or bound by Maya and are mad after sense enjoyment. The kings describe themselves in this category. This is what they say: deluded by the intoxication of riches, we wanted to conquer the earth, and thus we fought one another to achieve victory, mercilessly harassing our own subjects. We arrogantly disregarded you, O Lord, who stood before us as death. So that was much earlier on in the previous, in the 13th verse of the same chapter. So this touches on the question, how is one to live? It's a very important question. And for a king, the protocol for engaging in war, because that's what they're discussing. They just mentioned that they actually spend so much of their time actually fighting with one another and even harassing their own subjects, because naturally their own subjects get harassed if there's war going on. Nobody can be peaceful. So for a king, the protocol for engaging in war is to surround and coerce an enemy who approaches with an inimical disposition, who is addicted to sense pleasure. So this is when the king's permitted to go to war. So he's permitted to, get his forces in place. When somebody's approaching him who's addicted to sense pleasure, somebody's approaching him who's plundering the people's wealth and goods, and when it's a situation when advisors and troops have been alienated, then he's permitted to go into battle. So you could say that the actions of these particular kings were in accord with the protocol, but they acknowledged that they were failing to see death. Because the fact that they mention that they were constantly fighting with each other, it means that somebody came with some aggression. So naturally, one has to respond. If one's the ruler of one's kingdom and somebody's approaching with some inimical mood, one has to go into war. And they all see themselves as having been addicted to sense pleasure. So even the one who's the king who's addicted to sense pleasure, if one's the king who's aggressive towards him is addicted to sense pleasure, he's permitted to go into war, as vice versa. So they're all following protocol, but they acknowledged that they were failing to see death. And of course, birth and death apply to being embodied in the material world. It's just part of the package. And the king's new understanding is in accord with Lord Krishna's statements. So these are Lord Krishna's teachings, Bhagavad Gita 10:34. I am all devouring death, and I'm the generating principle of all that is yet to be. So mrityu sarva haras chaham, utbhavas cha bhavishyatam. Just the first part of the verse, that I'm all devouring death, because that's what the kings are seeing, that they fail to take into account. So absorbed were they in their fighting activity that they're acknowledging. They failed to see this particular aspect. So even though they're embodied, they were failing to see death. And Krishna himself is saying, I'm all devouring death. So Lord Krishna is also referencing an earlier statement on the part of the kings when he acknowledges and is in agreement with the idea that they expressed, and this was the idea they expressed, that lack of self-restraint arising from the intoxication with opulence and power leads to madness. So that was Krishna's agreeing with their view, because they had expressed a very similar view. And this was the king's understanding that they expressed to Lord Krishna. So he's saying, he's agreeing, lack of self-restraint arises from their intoxication with opulence and power, and this leads to madness. And the kings say this to Lord Krishna: infatuated with his opulence and ruling power, a king loses all self-restraint and cannot obtain his true welfare. Thus, bewildered by your illusory energy, he imagines his temporary assets to be permanent. So that was in the 72nd chapter. Now, this lack of sense control is an idea expressed by Lord Krishna to Arjuna. And there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. This is Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion, because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. That's what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. So his teachings, that's 334. So taken into account the breakdown of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, that from wealth comes the concept of power. One may consider the principle for a king regarding the proper usage of wealth, because you have to consider that principle. And this is how it's expressed. It's from one book entitled The Way of Kings that gives different protocols for kings. So this is how a king should be functioning, using his wealth properly. The collection of funds and treasure is for the maintenance of the forces and the commonwealth of the people, and for the performance of sacrifices and the bestowal of gifts. So that's actually how the king should be using their wealth. Now, the attachment and aversion Lord Krishna refers to, because he says that there are principles that have to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. So the attachment and aversion Lord Krishna refers to is overriding a principle for kings regarding wealth. Because here is another protocol for kings. Using wealth for indulgence in vice or nefarious activities is considered to be waste. Do not engage yourself solely in the pursuit of wealth. So it's a fundamental principle for kings to adhere to, not to engage themselves solely in the pursuit of wealth. And this is what the kings are acknowledging, that was precisely what they were doing. So, on the path of self-realization, attachment to Krishna consciousness or acting always in the loving service of Krishna detaches one from all kinds of sensory activities. So again, one can ask, how is one to live? Is it possible to be perfectly happy? It's a very relevant question, and certainly for persons in a rulership position, it's a very important question to look at, because some balance has to be struck to perform duties and have that sense of satisfaction of that the senses are being satisfied. So Srila Prabhupada explains, and this is from a purport in Bhagavad Gita 10.5, there is no prohibition against meeting the proper needs of the senses, but unnecessary sense enjoyment is detrimental for spiritual advancement. Therefore, the senses should be restrained from unnecessary use. And Srila Prabhupada reiterates, and this is applicable to the principles governing the use of wealth by a king. Control of the senses means that the senses should not be used for unnecessary personal enjoyment. So that's very relevant, Srila Prabhupada's statement, but it's relevant in terms of the kings and the usage of wealth by the kings. Similarly, one should restrain the mind from unnecessary thoughts, Srila Prabhupada's statement. And the kings, upon being freed, they express this understanding. And this is their words: never again will we hanker for a mirage-like kingdom, a kingdom that must be slavishly served by this mortal body, which is simply a source of disease and suffering, and which is declining at every moment. So that's what the king stated. So it means that the hankering on their part could be seen as akin to how they were using their mind. So their newfound usage of their mind is very much in accord with the injunctions given by Srila Prabhupada. One should not spend one's time pondering over earning money. And the kings, what were they concerned with? Accumulating more wealth. So that's how they were using their minds. So this is misuse of thinking power. Whether one's pondering over earning money, as Srila Prabhupada gives the example, or whether it's the king's pondering or hankering after greater wealth. They put it, they hankered after greater wealth. So the power of thought should be developed, and this is Srila Prabhupada, in association with persons who are authorities in scripture. So that's how one has to train the mind. And move one's thinking in that kind of direction. And for the kings, their thinking is being expressed to Lord Krishna, and he's reaffirming their thoughts. So there's a nice synchronization that's happening just by Krishna trying to encourage their devotional service, agreeing with what they've now come to understand. And Srila Vishwanath rephrases Lord Krishna's next statement, which embraces that of text 9, which reinforces that of text 19. So this is Srila Vishwanath. Krishna said, many kings have fallen from their positions, and the expression is sthanat sva padat, due to the intoxication of wealth. So Krishna is elaborating a bit further, reinforcing the king's thinking, and now giving examples of many kings have indeed fallen from their position due to the intoxication of wealth. So the examples that are listed of kings who fell from their position due to becoming intoxicated with wealth, the first example was Haya. And in fact, it's interesting because Haya was in the lineage leading to Kunti. So his son Dharma had a son Netra, who was the father of Kunti. So just to put it in context. And Srila Prabhupada writes how Krishna expresses himself to the kings. So I'm going to read how Srila Prabhupada puts it. This is Krishna addressing the kings. In the past, there were many rebellious kings, such as Haya, Nahusa, Vena, Ravana, and Narakasura. Some of them were demigods, and some of them were great demons, but because of their false perception of their positions, they fell from the exalted posts, and thus they no longer remained kings of their respective kingdoms, and were lost in the violence of abominable conditioned life. That's how Srila Prabhupada puts it. So notice this, where one's caught up, as the kings are explaining, hankering in their mind for great kingdoms, it's actually seen as, Srila Prabhupada's words, violence, falling into the violence of abominable conditioned life. So that's from Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Srila Prabhupada's writing of this section of how the kings are being addressed by Lord Krishna. Now there's a description of Ravana getting slain or falling from his exalted position, because that's what Krishna is using him as an example. So I'm just going to read this short little section. It comes from Srimad Ramayana, Volume 1, and it's Karnamrita Das. It's very basic. Upon reaching the city of Lanka, Ram slew Ravana in battle and got back Sita, but he became somewhat ashamed of her residence in another man's house and publicly criticized her. Not being able to tolerate such treatment, the chaste Sita entered fire. So Lord Krishna's extraordinary feat satisfied all the living beings within the universe, both moving and unmoving, the fact that he had killed Ravana. And the blissful Raghava was duly adored by the assembled hosts of demigods. So here you get an example of a king who was just wiped out by Lord Ramachandra. And his particular hankering in his mind had been due to that lustful propensity that he had, which had led him to kidnap Lord Ramachandra's wife, Sita. Thereafter, the Lord installed Vibhishan, this is continuing from Ramayana, upon the throne of Lanka and considered that he had accomplished something. He felt great ecstasy. So this is just to spell it out, the particular statement made by Lord Krishna to the kings when they released that here's an example. Somebody who just got wiped from his royal position and just had to fall into abominable conditioned life. Because here's a description how Lord Ramachandra installed Vibhishan upon the throne of Lanka. So Narakasura, his demise is described. And this was earlier on in the 59th chapter of the 10th canto. So I'm just reading a short section of how it is that Narakasura was struck from his position. Lord Hari then struck down all the missiles and weapons the enemy soldiers threw at him, O hero of the Kurus, destroying each and every one with 3 sharp arrows. Meanwhile, Garuda, as he carried the Lord, struck the enemy's elephants with his wings. Beaten by Garuda's wings, beak and talons, the elephants fled back into the city, leaving Narakasura alone on the battlefield to oppose Krishna. Seeing his army driven back and disoriented by Garuda, Balma, another name for Narakasura, attacked him with his spear, which had once defeated Lord Indra's thunderbolt. But though struck by that mighty weapon, Garuda was not shaken. Indeed, he was like an elephant with a flower garland, hit with a flower garland. Balma, frustrated in all his attempts, took up his trident to kill Lord Krishna. But even before he could release it, the Lord cut off his head with his razor-sharp chakra as the demon sat atop his elephant. So there's a description from the example. One of the kings listed of those who were infatuated with wealth and how they reached their demise. And in both cases, one in the hands of Lord Ramachandra and one at the hands of Lord Krishna. And this particular demon, Narakasura, was a demon who had kidnapped thousands of maidens. He was the son of the earth goddess, but another example, somebody who infatuated with wealth, or, in the mind there's the hankering for some sort of sensorial enjoyment, because it's contrary to the principles how a king should be both utilizing his wealth and his thinking capacity, should be on the path of self-realization. There's these 2 examples of just being, in the one case, demolished by Lord Ramachandra, Ravana, and in the second case, Narakasura, having his head cut off by Lord Krishna's sharp chakra. So these were 2 examples of demons who fell from their opulent position because of infatuation with material opulence. And the question is, are there things that matter more to you than happiness? There's that question. One has to think of it for oneself. And for the king, it's the advancement of humanity. It should matter to him more than his personal happiness. And the principles that guide his usage of wealth for the king are, and this is again coming from Way of Kings, strive to gain what has not yet been gained. What has been gained, carefully protect. Increase what has been protected by proper means. What has been increased, bestow upon worthy persons. So for the king, the fulfillment of these principles requires their dependence upon Lord Krishna and working under his protection. And in such service, being fully conscious of Lord Krishna. So these were some thoughts connected to these 2 verses. If there's any thoughts to expand the discussion.
Was you thinking the position of these kings as they pray to Krishna, and they present a picture of introspecting why did they got to the position, and being immensely grateful to receive Krishna's mercy. And they're in their prayers and gratitude, they see what they were saved, or what they were moving for in taking shelter of Krishna. And The one thought is that now these are very pious kings, obviously. That's some of the descriptions were there, and in fact, their readiness to and their capacity to be able to perceive this, the position and Krishna's position, and have that acumen to take shelter of Krishna, tells a lot of their piety and their righteousness and their strong position as pious kings or pious leaders. So there may be thing that sometimes you see devotees when they pray to the Lord, they see themselves as very fallen, and like Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami described, no one should even mention my name, because you become polluted. I'm lower than the worm stool. And so many examples of devotees feeling that way. And it's not something, the acharyas explain, it's not something that is fake, that the actual feel like that. I mean, sometimes you see immature devotees saying, I am the most fallen, blah, blah. Prabhupada chastised and said, you're not the most of anything. But so in one sense, we may be able to understand that, when these devotees express themselves in that way, is also tuning with the Lord's purpose of teaching, the world, or how to, in the message of, these type of dangers that are there with opulence and the desire to enjoy the world. And Krishna says that in the Bhagavad Gita too, that when one is infatuated with Bhoga and Aishwarya, which is being a controller and being an enjoyer, then one cannot have the intelligence to focus or to fully, exclusively surrender to Krishna. So just thinking about that this is also very special personalities, that is their part of Krishna Lila, and obviously they were qualified for that. So.
Oh, thank you. Yes, the picture I'm painting of that wealth leads to a sense of power, and then that intoxication with power leads to further kind of, you could say, loss of self-control in one sense. I mean, they put it lack of self-restraint. It's obviously, as you put it, that they are highly pious persons, and their position of being imprisoned by King Jarasandha just allowed them to reflect in this kind of deep way, where in fact they'd even gone to the extent of sending their messenger to Lord Krishna with some very similar kind of statements of how they'd actually failed to remember Lord Krishna or failed to depend upon him. But just by their actions and their realization, one has to understand that they've been dependent on Lord Krishna, but they're looking with putting it in a very hard light. They're understanding that really it does boil down to there having been some intoxication with their power. So that kind of putting things in, looking at something in a hard light, it allows for that sense of greater dependence on Lord Krishna. because one sees the danger. So they've spelt the dangerous position, and I guess I've tried to elucidate that they were following the principles that go along with being a ruler, but that fundamental principle of not using wealth in the incorrect way is a very important one. Not getting too enamored by it. Uh, so uh, they they're just putting things, looking at everything and shining a very hard light on themselves. So you're correct. Uh, they were, after all, in the world domination of King Jarasandha, they were the kings who refused to actually come under his domination. So, you're only going to uh, allow yourself to become subservient to another king if indeed you understand that entity to be greater than yourself. And obviously that was not the case, because they completely refused to give tribute to Jarasandha and King Jarasandha and come under his sway.
Yes. I was just, as you're speaking, came to my mind that just how you respond to everything taken away from you, then that is going to show where your level of consciousness is. So, the kings, their piety came naturally on those positions of being, deprived, or all their opulence and all their strength and the power has been taken away, and they surrender. And then you have the example of Ravana. Remember when we were hearing that for 100 years it was under the punishment of Lord Shiva, in an extremely painful situation, completely deprived of his pride, completely humiliated and punished, like helpless. And in a helpless condition, he spent 100 years, serving Lord Shiva. And what happens? Did he learn? Did he come? Did brought bring the devotion out? He didn't. He was always, with this mentality of how he can take advantage. So it's all calculated. So I'm gonna do this. So I please him. He frees me, and when he frees me, the first thing that he say, "I want your weapon." You know. Yeah. So, and then he goes on to do more demoniac stuff.
Yes. So. That's a very graphic example of the contrasting kingdom. And that was the contrast Lord Krishna made, that worldly kings are bound by Maya. And, it's a kind of madness. So that's a very good example of Ravana having his hands caught under the mountain for 100 years. And then when the mountain's lifted by Lord Shiva, he says, "I want your weapon." And of course, he knew the Vedas, so he dutifully chanted the appropriate praises to Lord Krishna, to Lord Shiva for those 100 years. But then what emerged was the consciousness, what the mind is actually focused on, which was, creating havoc for others. Yeah.
Thank you for your class, Mataji. I was appreciating as much of it as I could catch. I was thumbing through a book yesterday, I think Vaishnava K, and it was speaking about Yukta Vairagya. A Yukta Vairagi is a person that's, mature enough to use things for Lord's service. And it seems like it's a very thin line between being able to actually utilize these things, because if everything is controlled and owned by the Lord, even if we have pick a flower and smell it, or even if we pick a flower and smell it, or if we take a handful of say buttermilk and drink it, we still could think of ourselves as the Lord and the, straw in the street, because we're taking something that's owned by the Lord, because everything belongs to the Lord. So I think to me, it seems like it brings, it's very important to have devotee association, so you can have people that keep you in check, when the head gets kind of swollen. It's like, then have honest people around you to really keep you in check, so that you're not in your own world thinking even false humility or pride, like two opposites, but they could be, just as bad. Um, so I'm just appreciating the depth of the thoughts that these lessons provoke. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I guess it's one and the same, false humility and pride. It's, yeah, it's one and the same. But yeah, I mean, that was the particular message of Srila Prabhupada, that one acted under the guidance of authoritative persons, because that way the thinking is being allowed to shift to the right spot, because one already has a pattern of thinking, a pattern of enjoyment, or a pattern how one's senses like to satisfy themselves. So then when you actually hearing, like you was mentioning, these particular lessons, it's actually guiding the mind into a new pattern of thought. So that's why hearing, just as you pointed out, the various lessons coming through the stories in the Bhagavatam is very helpful for the mind. And indeed, this particular lesson had a lot to do with moving away from that position of pride, which Krishna describes as leading to madness. I mean, and in the purport of the disciples of Srila Prabhupada, they actually state it's like moving outside the boundaries of proper behavior. I mean, that's what pride does. It allows persons to be outrageous. Totally outrageous, because they're not acting within the boundaries of proper behavior. Their pride has really put them in a whole other space, mental space. Yeah. So thank you very much for your very kind attention. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.